Hello everyone and welcome to this Webit Global Impact Forum. My name is Afua Hagan and I will be your moderator for this session, which is entitled Greening the Capital Equipment Sector and Healthcare Industry Through Innovation. From specific technology to transformational projects, economics and public health have a big effect on each other. How can we use data to connect personalized healthcare with patient needs? Healthcare is evolving every single day, and the successful industry leaders will be those who truly focus on transformation. But in doing that, we also have to make sure we are building towards a sustainable future. Joining us today, we have leaders, innovators, and disruptors in healthcare and sustainability in both these industries to help us unpack this topic. So joining me today are Robert Metzke, Chief of Staff Innovation and Strategy and Head of Sustainability at Philips. Robert, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome. Thanks. Pleasure to be here.
And also joining me is Christoph Boone, Vice President, Global Head of Health Economics and Outcomes Research at Abbvie. Christoph, good afternoon or good morning where you are, and thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, just for clarification, it's Christopher, but you can call me Chris to make it simple.
Christopher, missed off an R there. I'm so sorry. And I'll call you Chris for the duration of this forum. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Afua Hagan and I'm going to be your moderator for this forum. You can also find us and share your thoughts throughout this discussion on social media. Please use the hashtag Webit. We want you all to get involved. Okay, so first question I'm going to put to both of you. Robert, and I'll start with you. How do you achieve and what are your strategies for greening the capital equipment sector through innovation? And of course, how about the healthcare industry? It's a big question.
Yeah, thanks, Afua. It's a great question. It's a great topic. So maybe let me start with throwing in a word on the why before we come to the how, very briefly. If you think where healthcare is today, then half of mankind does not have access to healthcare. That's 3.5 billion people. And already now we see an extremely resource-intensive industry that's also extremely polluting. The global emissions from the healthcare sector are 4.4% of the global footprint. Well, you could say, what's 4.4%? But it's more than the emissions from all airlines or shipping lines together, which is significant. So if healthcare would be a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter. There's about 13 kilograms of waste per hospital bed per day. And again, said that half of mankind does not have access to healthcare at home. So just giving that as a little bit of a background here, because that really means that we need to innovate the way how we design, how we purchase, how we produce, and in the end, how we deliver healthcare if you want to scale it, if you want to reduce the environmental impact. Now, if you ask me specifically in my role that I have at Philips, which is a global health technology company, then we try to really look at the big material topics where we can make a difference, which is making healthcare more accessible and reducing the environmental footprint. And one of the things, of course, that's on top of the mind of all of us is climate change. So that means science-based targets end-to-end, starting with our own operations, which is already carbon neutral since 2 years, but really looking into our supply chains and, of course, innovating with our and for our customers in the hospitals to help them deliver, let's say, low-carbon healthcare. The second pillar is around really moving towards circular business models, which means reducing the material footprint. We know that half of the carbon emission reductions need to come from these circular models. So think, for instance, about imaging as a service rather than selling an MR scanner, and we can talk about that later. And on the social side, it's really about making healthcare accessible. So it's not just about greening, it's greening with a purpose, reducing the footprint, being able to scale it, and to bring healthcare to those that do not have healthcare. Let me stop here as an opening statement.
Okay, thank you so much, Robert. Chris, I'm going to put the same question to you. So how do you achieve and what are your strategies for greening the capital equipment sector through innovation? And what about the healthcare industry?
No, I think I really appreciated Robert's response to that particular question, because it's really, when you think about some of the newer innovations, they really got to address certain issues within healthcare. The first being that we have to address this issue around developing more innovative cures, at least from a pharmaceutical perspective. We do have to find more scalable ways to achieve that, as we saw in this era of the pandemic, and even access to vaccines and the whole vaccine distribution cycle. certainly left some folks without access to the vaccine. So that has to be a problem we address in the future. I think this idea around healthcare equity, which is some like building off of this idea around access to care, certainly ends up being a particular issue to address as we start to think about greening the capital. But I think generally speaking, we want to be able to build a more sustainable global healthcare system. And I think that that's really what this boils down to. And there's been a number of initiatives that we've seen within the US and beyond, where certain organizations are looking to sort of reimagine the way that they deliver care in their respective regions or domains. And I think in the US, for example, we have a large healthcare system by the name of Kaiser Permanente, who has committed itself to being carbon net neutral or carbon net positive, actually, by the year of 2025. So that's an example of initiatives that you're seeing within healthcare as far as rethinking or reimagining the entire human health experience. And you have to do that by being caretakers of the environment, as well as providing direct healthcare access to many of the patients around the world.
So maybe if I can build on that just briefly, Chris, I like that you called out Kaiser Permanente, right? But they speak also about community health and planetary health. So I think that goes hand in hand with people that take the pledge of Hippocrates to do no harm, to really understand that this goes beyond the focus on the individual patient. So thanks, Chris. I very much appreciate it.
Now, let me ask you both a follow-up question to that. You said that half of the world doesn't have access to healthcare. Am I right in that statistic? I didn't make that up. So half of the world doesn't have access to healthcare. And so how do we get to the point where that half of the world does have access to healthcare? And I'm very sure that those people, to be honest, would be more concerned about having the healthcare that they need for themselves and their children, rather than it being green, rather than sustainability, because of the predicament that they are in, that they don't have access to this healthcare in the first place. So how do we get people to get that healthcare and get them to care about it being sustainable at the same time? Robert, I'll come to you with that one.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think a couple of elements, and we'll touch about it probably during this discussion more. So I'm not a blind technology believer, but I think that digitalization of healthcare has a big role to play. Because it makes it more accessible, it drives down the cost per treatment. It has benefits when we think about how care is delivered, how we can dematerialize healthcare equipment, for instance, which means less environmental footprint and so forth. This is not a technology question, though. It's not something that a health technology provider or a pharmaceutical company can solve. Neither can the government or an NGO or the World Health Organization. I think this is a very complex puzzle piece where all the different partners need to come together and putting the cards on the table and saying, okay, who has which part of the puzzle and how can they connect, right? So that extent, for instance, we have launched a digital connected care coalition 2 years back, where we really try to define concrete projects in Africa or in India, where we bring the different players together and say, how can we build something that works at a small scale as a proof point that can be scaled up, where the care providers, insurers, governments, patient organizations, technology providers all come together, carrying part of the burden, so to say. So it's a complex puzzle piece, but I think we cannot scale healthcare and make it accessible without drastically reducing the environmental footprint that we see today in the developed countries, which makes the discussion that we have about greening healthcare so important.
Chris, if you don't mind, I'll put the same question to you. So how do we make sure that we're providing healthcare to half of the world's population who don't have it, but also get them to care about the sustainability or the greening of it?
Unlike Robert, I probably am a blind technology believer, but I appreciate that statement. No, but I think generally, I do think that, if you asked me prior to the pandemic, what were some of the key drivers for innovations in addressing some of the world's most complex problems, I would have easily told you that I think disruptive technologies and public policies are the key drivers for anything materially happening that I think will ultimately move the needle. I think that what I would do now is I would annotate that statement, that sentiment prior to the pandemic, and amend it with, I think pandemic being certainly a catalyst for innovation, but more importantly, what it did was sort of, for all the things that were wrong about this global pandemic that we've endured, there were some silver lessons that we can carry forth. And one of those things is that with a shared vision collectively across the world, across industries, across organizations, that we can and we will ultimately address many of these issues. And I think when it comes to certainly the environmental factors, we've known for quite some time that in addition to sort of genetic factors, we also knew environmental factors played a huge role in the overall human health and just health of all species and on the planet Earth. Now it's a question of how do we mobilize and really address those particular issues. And I think that as we continue to see many of the leading organizations really put their own ESG plans forth, and they're making them transparent, and they're making commitments to fulfilling many of the goals that they've outlined, I think we will ultimately start to see a greater shift. I think that certainly a decade ago, I don't know if the incentive structure was in place to sort of activate that sort of reaction that we're seeing right now. But the thing is that, to Robert's point, I do think it's a highly complex issue, not a particular industry or not a particular facet or organization, whether it be public or private sector, can actually go at it alone. And I think that what we've seen in sort of the pandemic experience is this idea that a concerted effort with public-private partnerships, with public health, as well as other organizations outside of the industry of healthcare and life sciences, can really mobilize and really address these issues collectively. And that's the way that it should be. We've seen a number of organizations commit themselves to being carbon net neutral or carbon net positive. We've seen a number of organizations commit themselves, and even countries commit themselves, to being fully electric when it comes to the vehicles. We've seen greater sort of skepticism, and I think even open criticism of even the whole digital currency and what they feel like those impact of that is to the environment. And I think that the more we can educate many of the nations and also arm them with the resources they can to sort of build the infrastructure that would address the environment, I think we will see greater return. But this is the interesting thing. I think that generally, when you always think that the developed nations will be sort of the pioneers and the organizations that push things forward. I actually think many of the emerging markets and emerging countries have the ability to sort of leapfrog many of the developed nations, because they don't have many of those sort of that built-in resistance of we've always done it this way. But they also have we almost want to say a bare infrastructure to be able to sort of build from scratch. Right, they're not deconstructing to reconstruct, and I think that some of the bigger challenges you face in many developed nations is they put so much investment into building these infrastructures that they now have to deconstruct it to reconstruct it in a way that makes sense. And so anyway, I'll stop there.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you. So the next question again will go to both of you. How does your ambition to improve the lives of billions of people with meaningful innovations and access to healthcare relate to sustainability and your own strategy? So Robert, I'll come to you on that one.
Thanks, Afua. I think we started to touch on the topic a little bit, but maybe if I put it very bluntly, I would argue they just go hand in hand, right? Making healthcare accessible and sustainable are a core part of the strategy of our company. You cannot have the one without the other. So to your previous question, I don't think it makes sense to put peoples or country in a position where they have to choose between unsustainable healthcare or no healthcare. We have the technological means to provide healthcare that is compatible with the one planet that we have. I think that needs to be the core of the strategy. And so as a company, we have said we want to improve the lives of 2.5 billion people's lives by 2030, of which 400 million in underserved communities. And that means drastically reducing the footprint per treatment and really scaling care through digital solutions. So if you think about it, when we talk about the environmental impact areas and we do life cycle assessment, where we look which is the part, it's the production, is it the use, or is it the supply chain, where the impact is of the medical equipment, then you see that a large part is in the use phase. Hence, we have been investing in eco-designing our product portfolio since 30 years now, really main scaling that through billions of investments in R&D. And we are now at 70% of eco-designed revenues from our entire portfolio. We will scale it to 100% of new product introductions in the next 4 years. I think that makes a difference. The other thing that we did last year, we have science-based targets, which means that the emissions from the entire chain, including supply chain and use phase, will be in line with a maximum global warming of 1.5 degrees. So we have translated that into development roadmaps for all our products at a product level for the next 5 years to discuss with the product engineers what are the technical requirements for imaging equipment and the other things that we do to be in line with these requirements. I think that makes a difference, and it really helps to scale healthcare, but scale it in a way that does not destroy the planet, which is a boundary condition for healthy living. So my answer to your question, short answer, they go hand in hand, two sides of the same coin.
I like that, two sides of the same coin. And Chris, the same question to you. How does your ambition to improve the lives of billions of people with meaningful innovations and access to healthcare relate to sustainability and your own strategy?
Yeah, our sort of our ESG framework is really sort of predicated on three key strategies, and I really sort of commend our CEO and the team that's worked on this actively to sort of for developing something that was thoughtful. And the first thing is that we will still be committed to developing innovative medicines. That's why we're here. That's what we do. That's what we develop. So if nothing else, that's all about delivering and manufacturing these medicines and getting it to all parts of the world sort of in an equitable way as best we can. The second part of that is really sort of our commitment to building diverse teams that I think and recruiting talented folks and sort of reflect the communities around the world that we all and all the populations that actually use the medicines that we manufacture and develop. And the third is that this sort of idea of long-term advancing long-term patient health and doing it with a rather resilient business model. I think one of the bigger criticisms you hear from some of the business leaders around the world is that it goes against their business model. And the idea is that how do you sort of build this philosophy, advance this notion of continuously, as you stated, met and meaningful innovations and access, while also sort of building a resilient business model to address it. And that's a challenge that we have to take it upon ourselves to sort of cultivate, but at the same time commit ourselves to doing what we sought out to do, which is developing medical innovations for all patients.
Okay, you mentioned medical innovations there. I'm just going to pick up on that. So Chris, excuse me, I'll start with you. What are the latest innovations that you're implementing and the latest initiatives that you're supporting that you would like to share with our audience?
I think in addition to sort of the ESG framework that I talked about, what I think is huge, because there's a lot that goes into it and a lot to unpack. I'm sort of giving you the three very, very, very 30,000 or 100,000 foot level views. But in addition to that, I mean, we've committed ourselves to obviously doing things around clinical trial diversity, which is very, very huge and seems to be a global phenomenon of really understanding how certain drugs and therapies work in particular subpopulations around the world. I think we've moved beyond the era of just thinking that you develop a medication or medicine and it's going to treat all people the same way, and you're going to get the same sort of positive clinical outcome. And we know that not to be true. So we're very committed to that. I think the other part of that is really, to Robert's earlier point, is accelerating this idea around digital technologies and what it means for every particular facet of our business, from everything from sort of the discovery of a molecule or to the development through clinical trials, to sort of the manufacturing and distribution through our supply chain, and even the commercialization, and really understanding like how do we become much more efficient and productive, but also what are the clinical outcomes in all these different patient populations around the world. And so that sort of links back to your earlier question around meaningfully impacting patients around the world. We also, there's sort of a multi-pronged process to using that, but I think just at a foundation, the digital technologies, I think, is a huge enabler to making all of that happen.
And the same question to you, Robert. What are your latest innovations that you're implementing and the latest initiatives that you're supporting that you'd like to share with the audience?
Yeah, thanks, Afua. Let me build on what Chris just said. So I think there's so much happening in the healthcare sector when it comes to digitalization. The same goes for us, right? We have and thousands of researchers. More than half of them are working on software and AI, which may not be familiar to many people that know the Philips brand. But so this is really where the forefront, I think, of health technology is, which means, for instance, enabling more seamless data flows that empower decision makers, care providers, to really make the right decisions, first-time right diagnostics, find the right care pathway, moving towards even maybe individualized care pathways, right? So that is really the forefront, but also streamlining care processes through hospitals, or thinking about allowing a better patient monitoring in a general ward, something that we have seen during COVID, where the ICUs were just totally overcrowded. So basically anything digital that helps drives better clinical outcomes, moves people out of these intensive, costly and environmentally detrimental hospitals into either the treatment or the preventative phase, or allows them to go home faster and quicker. Maybe on the greening side, Afua, just two examples. One is, for instance, we have developed a miniaturized handheld ultrasound device. So the entire technology is in the probe, basically, and you just plug it into your telephone, your iPhone, or whatever you have at hand, and use that as a screen. And you can also use then a 3G or 4G connection to get a second opinion in from a nearby hospital. So that allows, for instance, then care providers, which don't need to be sonographers, for instance, in the field, to triage pregnant women, understand risks, and refer women with a risky pregnancy to a secondary clinical center. Energy efficient, lots more, much less weight in it, highly digitalized, and really driving access to care. I think that's a wonderful example. There are many more, but I think that gives a little bit an idea of what's happening. There's a lot happening.
Yeah, it certainly does, definitely. Okay, Chris, I'll come to you with this one for us. How do you implement data and analytics and tech innovation in order to personalize treatment, to improve the patient experience, and to improve healthcare in general?
Yeah, I think there's certain things that are happening right now that you see across all industries, but specifically in healthcare life sciences. There's sort of a consumerization of healthcare that's taken place, where people are demanding higher quality. They're demanding sort of a personalized experience that's relevant to them in their particular situations. And the only way you can really do that is by utilizing data that's available to sort of say, I know what this person is experiencing and how they're dealing with it. For us specifically, though, I think from our perspective as in a pharmaceutical company, it's really around understanding like what is the safety, what's the sort of efficacy and effectiveness of a drug in patients, and what can we do to sort of improve that sort of desired clinical outcome. And we use all the data that we capture from that in order to sort of personalize that. And when you hear the term personalized medicine or precision medicine in healthcare, it's really around getting that patient the right treatment that's tailored to them at the right time, right? I mean, that's really ultimately what we all strive to do, to get the most desirable clinical outcomes. So we use data from electronic health records. We use data from wearable technologies that Robert was mentioning. We use a lot of the genome sequencing data that you get from places like 23andMe. I think that it's interesting because there's really sort of a natural convergence in relation to this conversation, which is almost like around sort of the graining of the world and investments in capital technologies. It's really sort of, I see a convergence of human health and the environment, as well as sort of this idea around genetics and nutrition and all the other things that make up our experiences, and how we can learn more about how the environmental factors contribute to the overall health of an individual. And those are the things that we're learning right now. So when we use data and a lot of the advanced analytical technologies, that's ultimately what we're trying to understand. How do we improve overall human health with all the things that we know about the current state of the world, beyond just what we knew we were capturing from when people visited their doctors or when they were in the hospital? We now have a wealth of information about what happens outside of the walls of a provider environment. And those are the informations that we're using to be smarter, to develop interventions that would, both policy, just public health interventions or whatever they are, to sort of improve the overall state of human health in these particular environments.
Thank you for that. So Robert, the same question to you. How do you implement data and analytics and tech innovation in order to personalize treatment, to improve the patient experience and to improve healthcare in general?
Yeah, so there's a lot happening, of course, building on what Chris said, and I also touched about briefly on that earlier. Part is understanding that there's a lot of data in principle available. So how do you unlock that, right? So in a way that is, let's say, still patient-centric and puts the patient in charge, basically. So that's very important when we talk about data. So unlocking data in a way that allows care providers to make personalized decisions and treating patients better. I think that is core of what we do, for instance, with the Philips Health Suite platform that is connecting different care providers and empowering them to make better decisions. Applications of that you see also, for instance, maybe building on that, then using AI to interpret radiology pictures and providing diagnostic support for radiologists, allowing them to faster zoom in on potential risks and understanding is it a carcinoma, for instance, or not. These type of things are very important. Then, yeah, let me stop here. There's so much going on, but I think it's really in unlocking data in a safe way, and it is about using them to support diagnostics, and then, of course, understanding specific patient conditions and linking them to successful treatments, which comes to the field of personalized medicine that Chris was already speaking about.
Thank you very much for that, Robert. So Robert, I'm going to come back to you first with this question. As a sustainability head, could you please share your strategies to improve and empower sustainability, corporate responsibility, and well-being in the workplace?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I mean, the workplace, we have about 80,000 employees globally, and empowering them to be part of that transition is, I think, the fun part of the job, so to say, but also the essence of it as Chief Sustainability Officer, because I don't think that a staff department or a couple of people can really drive that. As I said, sustainability and sustainable development is a core part of the company strategy. So how do you drive that? And I would argue, I'm being based in Amsterdam or close to Amsterdam, we have a lot of bikes here. I use this example of bike locks with these little numbers. You know, you have 4 digits, and if you have 2 or 3 digits in the correct order, you cannot just take the bike and go away. You need to have all 4. So these 4 digits for a successful transformation, including sustainability, it starts with a joint narrative. What is the comprehensive story that the 80,000 people buy in? That is linked to our purpose, improving people's lives, but how do we make it personal, right? So that's the dialogue around it. The second one is about empowering and engaging with leaders, formal and informal leaders, that they walk the talk, that they share the story and make it part of their decision making so that people see that. The third element for me is really around empowering people. So if they are fired up, they see the leaders walk the talk and they want to do that, they need to know how to do that. If you talk about moving massively to circular economy, eco-designing every single piece of equipment that you put in the market, science-based targets, there are so many questions. People have not studied for that. So you need to equip them, build the capabilities. We have Philips University, online trainings, in practice, field trainings, whatever. So really building the capabilities is the third of these 4 digits. And the fourth one is embedding it in the processes. So if people have done everything right, you don't want to punish them at the end of the year with deducting a part of the salary for doing everything right. So it needs to be embedded in the remuneration. It needs to be embedded in the product development, launch and maintenance processes. It needs to be part of the strategy development, linking it not just to maximizing profits, but to driving social impact in the innovation processes and so forth. So that's the process embedding. So all 4, I would say, are key. If you ask me what it takes to get people moving and to make it a great place to work, where people actually feel not these cognitive dissonances between somebody talking about sustainability and another one making financial decisions that are contradictory. So I think it needs to come together.
And Chris, I'll ask you the same question. As a sustainability head, could you please share your strategies to improve and empower sustainability, corporate responsibility, and well-being in the workplace?
wouldn't classify myself as a sustainability head, but what I will say is I'm one of the functional leaders in the organization that's sort of an ambassador of the mission that's been outlined by our sustainability head in our organization. And I think that you guys all operate with sort of the same framework in mind, Robert. And what I've seen is that defining a clear vision that people buy into, and the vision for our company, our Abbvie, it's been sort of expanding the definition of sustainability, which sometimes can be very narrowly focused on environmental effects. But for us, especially in light of all the events that we saw here in the US over the last few years, it's been expanded to sort of a social justice, social equity, and economic development. And the organization has committed itself to addressing that problem from the inside out, which requires outlining a vision, having all the senior leaders model the behavior that we want to see, and empowering the people to carry that vision through a number of task forces that are focused on different aspects of it, and really actively measuring and monitoring that performance against benchmarks and metrics that have been outlined every year. And I think that that's really where it is. So it becomes more, to Robert's point, or less about the talk and more about the actions and the impact. And so I think that's where it is. I'm being held accountable to a number of metrics that are associated with our efforts around sustainability. And I think that that is certainly the right way to make a measurable impact and advance this goal in the way that we know we need to do.
Thank you for that. Chris, I'm going to come to you for this one. You talked earlier about your work on clinical trials and doing them in different subgroups of people. So what are your strategies for achieving diversity and building trust in clinical trials?
Yeah, but this, the clinical trial diversity piece is directly linked to our sustainability efforts, right around that pillar around social equity, social justice is where we link it to. And I think for us, it's more than just recruiting people. You want to retain them too once they actually become part of the study. And what we found is fundamentally the larger issue that we've seen is a lack of trust from various communities that in their ability to really participate and not really seeing the value for them. So part of that is really sort of embedding yourself in these various communities, being part of it, having having these communities be representative or have their voice being heard as we think about this issue of clinical trial, and really educating people on why it's important. I think that there was no greater lesson for the general public than the pandemic, and them understanding like what active participation and involvement in clinical trials means for the development of vaccines and medicines. And so prior to that, I would have said it's a bit tougher. Now I think you're seeing more people, if for no other reason than the altruism, they want to be part of it because they want to see cures for many of these viruses and disease that we've seen in our world today.
Thank you for that. Robert, I'm going to come to you with this one. Many organizations struggle with the tension between innovation, strategy, and sustainability. How do these relate to one another, or are they intertwined?
Well, they should be intertwined. Thanks, Afua. Actually, I would say it doesn't make sense to develop sustainability strategies in 2022. What you need are sustainable strategies, right? As long as it remains a Friday afternoon activity, it is something that will be scaled down. We are entering, I think, a decade of much higher volatility and tensions that we see globally. Starting with the COVID pandemic, we have a war in Europe, we have massive supply chain disruptions. So there are headwinds wherever you're looking. I think social tensions are mounting. So whenever a company does not manage to really embed ESG and purpose and impact in their core metrics and their core strategy, and it remains a Friday afternoon activity, it will be scaled down and pushed off the table eventually. So I think should be one and the same. A company that wants to be relevant in the next 5 or 10 years needs to understand where the world is going, what customers expecting, what society is expecting, and optimizing, I think, for the core set of stakeholders that we have, not just for shareholders, which are important stakeholders, but not all of them, right? So I think how you make decisions, how you understand trends, how you embed that in the strategy is essential.
Definitely. So this is to both of you. So Chris, I'll come to you first. On a personal note, what is it that makes you so passionate about sustainability?
Shall I go first?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, Chris, I'll
No,
continue.
I think ultimately, anytime you bring up this topic, it really is something near and dear to my heart, because we all felt that we want to leave the world in a better place than we found it, certainly for future generations. And I feel like that's a sort of an obligation for the world today, is to create a better world for future generations. And I think that the idea of sustainability, although we focused a lot today on sort of the environmental impact, is, as I just said, there are other aspects of it that I think are equally important as well. And if we start to look at it through all those different lenses, and we ensure that it's not just limited to developed nations, which oftentimes I hear about, and we really sort of look at the world as a global, as sort of a global impact, which is what this conference is all about. That nothing more excites me more than that. And I think that in healthcare and life sciences specifically, as an industry, we have this opportunity to sort of reassess or reevaluate who we are, and reimagine it, and with just the most innovative technologies we can, that sort of reinforce all the principles that we've outlined around this issue of sustainability. And so I think what better legacy to leave than to leave one where future generations can build on it and build a better world than we know it to be today. So.
Yeah, definitely. I hear that. And Robert, the same question to you. What makes you so passionate about sustainability?
Well said, Chris. It's a complex question, but I think it triggers, it goes deep. I started out studying physics and even astrophysics, so you could say I'm the big picture guy. But if you think about it, the age in which we live, with 7.5 billion people, which we have learned to feed somehow, right? I think we are at an inflection point. So if you look at the big challenges, and if we want to make a difference, the task for our generation is to navigate that transition, and to learn how to live and organize mankind, basically ourselves, in line with the one planet that we have. So I love complex challenges, and I think that's the single most important one. That's the task of our generation. So it's always difficult for me to understand how somebody cannot be obsessed with sustainable development. But hey, that's my pitfall.
And last question to you both. This session has flown by, but we're in the last few minutes. So Chris, I will come to you. Tell me, how do you see the future of healthcare, and what are the new trends coming that our audience should be aware of?
Well, I mean, I think we've talked a lot about a lot of different aspects of it, and to some degree, we've touched on many different things. I think this idea of virtual care, the ability to sort of democratize access to care globally, is going to be huge. We're seeing that through a lot of the telehealth technologies that are out there, where we're getting access to care in some of the most remote parts of the world. I think that'll be very, very interesting to see how that evolves, and and how that matures in many respects. I think the sort of expansion or acceleration of the idea of artificial intelligence, or augmented intelligence, if you want to call it that, and how we're able to sort of do much more predictive analytics, and how we can get out in front of pandemics or endemics in the future, I think will be very, very key to the overall human health experience. I think the idea of, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, Afua, with the idea around personalized or precision medicine, I think that's here to stay, and that's only going to grow in significance and importance. I think there'll be different sort of dimensions of it, though. I think that we're using it somewhat as a very broad, nebulous term, but I think that it'll be in the idea of precision public health, which is the idea of targeting certain patient clusters around the world and actively getting interventions there before things, become chaotic. I think it'll be in sort of personalized medicine, where an individual, we know exactly what that individual needs, which may be different from each individual on this particular panel, and what you need is different than what I need, and so on and so forth. I think that we'll see innovations in what I like to call precision sort of reimbursement or payment, which is how do you fund these initiatives, which is always the rate limiting factor when it comes to innovative technologies, and sort of the scalability of these things is hard to pay for. And so I think we'll see greater innovations in those spaces, and that's where I think the future trends are.
Okay, and Robert, just quickly from you, last few seconds, future of healthcare and the new trends that we should look out for.
A little to add, thanks, Chris. If I would give a couple of bullets, I would say more accessible, more sustainable, more digital, much more personalized, predictive, closer to the patient, I think, and you elaborated greatly on that, Chris.
Thank you both so very, very much. Chris and Robert, thank you for your time.
Pleasure.